Hello and welcome to my three-part video series on what Mass intentions are. This is part one, what is a Mass intention, Mass as a sacrifice. And so that's the first principle we want to cover, that Mass is a sacrifice, that it presents again the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross, that his one sacrifice, which was sufficient for all grace and all salvation for all of time, is made present again. We do not re-sacrifice Christ, but it becomes present again at the Mass so that we can enter into that sacrifice. And this is why we call it the sacrifice of the Mass. And the Old Testament anticipated this. This is why the Old Testament sacrifices are often focused on blood when they tie into the covenant. And then we hear St. Paul in his letter to the Colossians talk about making up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. And this is this language of us participating. Christ's sacrifice was perfect and missing nothing, but what we're making up is our ability to enter into that moment. And so our sacrifices do not add to Jesus' sacrifice, but they allow us to participate in what he has already done. And so put it another way, if we can put some skin in the game when we participate in Mass, we more fully dispose ourselves to receive the grace of that one perfect sacrifice made present at the Mass. So in practice, one way we do this is through this idea of Mass intentions, where we give people a chance to sacrifice something through the Mass that allows them to enter into this participation. And so this is the idea of a Mass intention. Now, some people call it buying a Mass, and that's misnomer. Really, you aren't buying the Mass. What you're doing is having a Mass said for your intention and then giving a financial sacrifice and offering so that you are more invested in, again, participating in this reality. Because ultimately, attending and participating in Mass is always free. You don't have to pay anything to benefit from Mass. You can always have your own prayer intentions, offer your communion and your time there for whatever intention that you have. And as a note, and we'll get to this again later, the priests can accept Mass intentions for free. However, the standard practice is that someone gives money to the priest in order for him to have Mass said for that intention. Again, this investment, this sacrificial piece. And that payment is one way of connecting to that sacrifice. We also know that in the Old Testament and in the church today, we are required to support the church, to support our priests. And in Old Testament times, the priest benefited from the things sacrificed to God, right? For some of the sacrifices in ancient Israelite practice, part of the requirement was that the priests eat part of the meat of the sacrificed animal. This was one way that the people provided for the needs of the priest, because unlike the other Israelites, the Levites and the priests did not have their own land or other ways to make money. So this is part of that support. And we want to know, of course, that's different from the annual Old Testament tithe that was given to support the temple and the priests. Even back then, there was these two different methods of providing for the worship of God: tithing and then the sacrifices themselves. St. Paul tells Timothy in Scripture, right? Scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it is threshing, and a worker deserves his pay." Now, this idea that, like, if the ox is pulling the plow, he should be able to nibble on some of the food as he's doing the work. And so the same saying goes that anyone who is laboring ought to be paid and compensated appropriately. A priest is laboring in order to celebrate the Mass. So there's a basic principle: he does work, he should be paid for that. And this Mass intention makes the connection more explicit and obvious. I've given money to this priest, he will do the work of saying Mass for my intention, allowing me to enter into that sacrifice and benefit me and the person I'm praying for. Now, it's important to know that this money given for a Mass intention does not support the parish. It supports the priest directly. The Old Testament practice of tithing was transformed into the New Testament practice of weekly collections at Mass and envelopes and so on. The Old Testament sacrifices, where the priest ate the meat of the sacrifice, is transformed into Mass intention, where that money is given to the priest to provide for himself personally. money for Mass intentions goes to the priest who celebrates the Mass for that intention. And in some poorer parts of the world, this is the primary way that a priest affords to live and to eat. Now, for us in the United States, it's really kind of just lagniappe. It's not significant as part of our income. So, when a priest formally accepts a Mass intention, he is making a promise to celebrate a Mass for that intention as his primary and official intention. He can do this even if he does not accept money for it. He can make this commitment: I will say Mass for your intention. Usually there's an offering, but it doesn't have to be. It is a spiritual and contractual obligation. The Church has her own legal system with laws and even courts. Mass intentions are regulated by church law. So theologically and legally, a priest must fulfill every intention he accepts and isn't allowed to take more than a year's worth of intentions. It's by the law of the Church. And if he takes too many intentions and does not fulfill them, he will answer for that, at the very least, at last judgment. Or if he's continuing to break church law, he could get in trouble with his bishop. God expects us to keep our promises. Now, the word intention gets a little fuzzy. The Church's law sees it as one intention per Mass. People, however, tend to see the word intention as loosely sort of anything I want to pray for at Mass. And that works, but we don't want to get too confused with that language, so I'll try to be consistent and clarify that. A priest can only have one official or primary intention for a Mass, but he can have as many private intentions or prayer requests or desires as he wants, because the Mass does have infinite grace. So, to give an example, Father Boudreau can agree to celebrate your Mass for your grandma, and you give him $5, and he agrees to that. But then he can also privately pray for a bunch of other people, so long as he does not accept an offering for that, or make a commitment to fulfilling it as a primary Mass intention. And so it's that kind of thing when somebody walks into the sacristy at the last minute: oh, Father, my friend is sick, or this person's dying, can you pray for me at Mass? Yes, I can. That's not a problem. It's just not going to replace the Mass intention I've agreed to, that's in the bulletin, that money has been given for. It helps to also know that a pastor is committed. He's required to say one Mass each Sunday and each holy day of obligation for his people, and cannot accept any intentions or money for that Mass other than that. And so that's the pro populo Mass, to put it in Latin. And so this is why you'll see only one Mass intention on some of the Masses, and it will say pro populo or the people of this parish or something like that. So to review, we'll talk about the terminology just to make sure that it's clear. A Mass intention is the official obligation that a priest has for that Mass. So in the example of Father Boudreau, your grandma is his Mass intention, the official obligation he has to say the Mass for that purpose. When we say to fulfill a Mass intention, it's just a way of saying he has now done what he promised to do, and the money connected to that is now available to him because he's done his task. And that money we often call an offering, a Mass offering, or even just an offering, and that refers to the money attached to that intention, the $5 that you gave to Father Boudreau for your grandma. It's sometimes called a stipend or a Mass stipend. It's just another way of talking about it, but it's usually called an offering in canon law. Now, I just want to make it clear, the Mass offering is not the same as the offertory. The offertory is what we're talking about in the middle of Mass, the collection, the music, the preparing of the gifts. Now we're talking about the offering attached to the Mass intention, his official obligation. And just to clarify, the priest can only accept one Mass offering for one intention, and he can only take that money, he can only accept that offering or stipend when he's fulfilled his Mass intention. We'll cover more details about how this is regulated and how it's not the selling of sacred things in our next video.